During the Second World War, a large number of atrocities and war crimes were committed by the various armies of the conflict. Some of the most brutal and savage were punished after the war had come to an end in trials, but a large number went unpunished. Trials such as the Nuremberg trials took place to bring the perpetrators of those crimes committed by the Nazi government and Third Reich to justice, and the Tokyo war crimes trials also held the major aggressors of the Japanese war effort to account. But the Japanese war crimes were considered some of the worst of the whole of the Second World War, and the Japanese army gained a reputation for committing horrific atrocities and massacres. One of those saw 22 Australian army nurses, women who were on Bangka Island and were caring for people, machine gunned down and mown down in a horrific massacre that also saw over 50 Australian and British soldiers and crew members executed in barbaric fashion. There were only 3 survivors of the whole massacre. So join us today as we look at the brutal executions of the nurses of Bangka Island, and remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 12th of February 1942, it looked as if Singapore was about to fall to the Japanese army. The Japanese had been advancing throughout different regions, causing chaos even before the war officially began for them, or when they joined the Axis alliance. As Singapore was about to fall, 65 Australian army nurses were evacuated on a small coastal steamer ship named the Vyner Brooke. Also on board the ship were over 200 civilians fleeing for their safety, and a number of English military personnel and members of staff. On board were also a number of injured members of the armed forces, but as the ship was on its way to its destination, it was attacked. Japanese aircraft were flying overhead, and they strafed and bombed the ship, which was greatly overloaded. The bombs hit the ship and it sank very quickly. There was panic on board, with many people clambering for their lives, and the survivors headed for the lifeboats on board the ship, and also left the boat, where they were then again strafed by Japanese aircraft. Many people were killed on board the ship, or drowned at sea, as it was passing between Borneo and Sumatra. 12 Australian nurses were killed in the attack, or drowned at sea, but 53 remaining nurses, along with other people, managed to get on board the lifeboats, cast away and drift with the tide. They reached Bangka Island, which is an island to the east of Sumatra. Today it's the 9th largest island in Indonesia and has a population of over 1 million, but during the Second World War it was captured and occupied by the Japanese. When the nurses arrived, they wore their Red Cross armbands, which they believed would give them some sort of protection. This was true as they were supposed to be given protected status as non-combatants, and they were expected to be treated with respect and also in a civilised way. Around 100 survivors reunited together from the ship, and they met up on Raji Beach, but it was quickly realised that those who occupied the land were the Japanese. Talks were held upon landing on the beach, and an officer from the ship tried to find the Japanese to surrender the group of survivors of the ship to them and to turn over as prisoners of war. Whilst the officer was away, the most senior nurse who survived, Irene Melville Drummond, said that the civilian women and the children should leave for the town of Muntok. It was said that the nurses should then also stay behind on the beach to care for any wounded survivors who washed up there. Here the nurses established a shelter to triage patients, which was labelled with a big Red Cross sign on it, indicating they were not a military threat and were simply nurses administering medical care. Fires on the sand were lit, and the survivors huddled around together to keep warm as the evening set in. The next day, the ship's officer arrived at the beach with around 20 Japanese soldiers. The soldiers commanded all of the wounded men to gather together, and then they were split into 2 groups. The soldiers then pointed towards half of the shipwrecked men to follow them around the cove. A short time later they came back, and they were seen wiping their bayonets, and they then called for the second men to follow them. The men did this, and whilst they were there, they saw the corpses of the first group floating in the water. The nurses heard a quick volley of shots, and what the Japanese had done was just massacre around 60 British and Australian soldiers and crew members who should have been considered prisoners of war. Those who had not been killed initially by the shots were then bayoneted to death, with the Japanese plunging their knives into their bodies. When the Japanese returned again, they sat by the nurses and wiped their bayonets again and cleaned their rifles. Shortly after this, the Japanese then began to order the nurses and women to stand up and to line up and walk into the surf of the sea. The nurses didn't know, but a machine gun had been set up on the beach. The Australian nurses and a civilian woman were forced to walk together into the sea, and whilst facing the horizon, as soon as they entered the water, the machine gun opened up on the nurses, and each one fell one by one. All but one of the women were executed in barbaric fashion. The massacre on the beach was a terrible atrocity, which highlighted the barbarism of some elements of the Japanese army. Vivian Bullwinkle was the only woman to have survived the attack, as a bullet passed through her body and missed her vital organs. She lay in the shallow water stunned and feigned her death, with the waves washing over her, and she only just recovered as the Japanese soldiers left. She then looked around and she saw her dead nurses and friends around her, floating bodies in the sea. Vivian worried that the soldiers would come back, so she entered the jungle wounded and hid out. She came across another injured person from the ship, Private Cecil George Kingsley, who had wounds to his abdomen and shoulder. Vivian looked after him for 12 days, and she relied on food from the locals. But they then walked into the town of Muntok to surrender, as they could not wait out for years or the Japanese to surrender. Once they arrived there, the pair were placed in jail with other shipwrecked civilians and people, but the prison was barbaric. Kingsley passed away as he was not given any medical care, and also the Japanese gave him hardly any food. Eventually the civilians and survivors were then taken to a prisoner of war camp, and Bullwinkle spent 3 years inside of one. She had told her fellow nurses what happened at the beach, and they all swore to protect her life, to make sure that the story of the massacred men and women would be told to the world. It was considered that the Japanese would kill her, as she witnessed the massacre and the executions. The Australian public did not know about the massacre until after the Second World War. One newspaper report from the Times states between 30 and 35 nurses were either shot, bayoneted or drowned. The Japanese lined up the remainder of the survivors, facing the sea, and motioned them towards the water. A soldier with a Tommy gun ruthlessly shot down nurses, civilians and merchant sailors. The Japanese then bayoneted those whose fate was uncertain. It was said that the women went to their deaths knowing what was going to happen, as they heard the firing from the previous massacres of the men. Vivian Bullwinkle, the only nurse who survived, did live to see out the end of the Second World War, and after she testified at the Japanese War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo in 1946. She told the world the horrific story of the massacre of the nurses. She said, "The Japanese came back and sat in front of us, and when they had finished cleaning their rifles and bayonets, they stood up, and the one in charge suggested that we should go towards the sea. He sent a couple of soldiers to push us along. We went towards the sea and kept walking. When we were up to our waists, they started firing up and down the line with the machine gun. There was only one machine gun. They just swept up and down the line, and the girls fell one after the other. I was towards the end of the line, and a bullet got me in the left loin and went straight through and came out towards the front. The force of it knocked me over into the water. There were 23, including myself, 22 nurses and 1 civilian. Of the 65 nurses on board the Vyner Brooke, 12 drowned at sea and 21 were shot from behind, being executed in the water at Raji Beach. 32 women were sent to prisoner of war camps, and all suffered terribly throughout the war, with starvation and ill treatment. A number would succumb to their sickness. No one was ever punished for their role in the massacre, and the perpetrators were never tracked down, and today their identity remains unknown, and there was no punishment at all for the atrocities and the executions. Some of the locals who live near the beach refer to it as English Bay because of the slaughter of the people which occurred there. It has been said that pieces of bone have washed up there, and the residents refused to eat fish from the area for a long time because of the bodies and the fact it was a site of massacre. The Bangka Island massacre saw 22 Australian Army nurses and around 60 men, including soldiers and crew members of the ship, slaughtered by the Japanese. By the rules of war, the survivors should have been taken as prisoners of war, but the state of the concentration camps in Asia and the forced labour camps were terrible. The executions on the beach show us how awful armies and militaries could be during World War II, as the slaughter of innocent nurses who were involved in caring for anyone injured is the worst of the worst war crime. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.